What's Othello really about, according to Pantaloon? Desdemona protests, "I never gave him cause." And Emilia replies, "But jealous souls will not be answered so. They are not ever jealous for the cause, but jealous for their jealous. It is a monster, begot upon itself, born of itself." That is the best explanation that she can offer. Jealousy just appears from nowhere. But Shakespeare, I think, provides a more sophisticated analysis of the condition. He demonstrates that it does have causes, and he explores the wider factors involved. Then he even shows that it is not restricted to one atypical character. Othello is not the only person who is eaten by the monster. So that we can witness the progress of the psychological disease, jealousy, the playwright begins by creating the impression on Othello's first entrance that the soldier is quite immune from any emotional pressures. Iago makes repeated attempts to disturb his equanimity. He alleges that Roderigo has impugned Othello's honour, but only receives the reply, "'Tis better as it is." Next he warns Othello that Brabantio will use his connections to activate the law against him. But again the general stays calm. Let him do his spite. Then when Cassio arrives, Iago deliberately misleads Othello. "Those are the razed father and his friends," and urges him to run away from the assumed threat. "You had best go in." But still Othello remains unmoved. "Not I must be found." Even when Brabantio does appear, with Iago trying to raise the emotional temperature, he comes to bad intent, and swords are drawn. The general refuses to be panicked. After a lifetime spent in warfare on battlefields, he stays completely relaxed at a mere domestic brandishing of weapons, and is able to make a joke. "Keep up your bright swords, for the dew will rust them." And even when Brabantio threatens violence, Othello keeps command of the situation. "Hold your hands, both you of my inclining and the rest." And, importantly, he keeps command of himself, using a metaphor to distance himself from involvement. "Were it my cue to fight, I should have known it without a prompter." So Othello seems not only the victor in many previous physical conflicts, but also absolutely impregnable to assaults on his emotional stability. However, when we examine the scene further, we find that perhaps he's not totally unassailable. He relies partly on his outstanding status as military protector of the state, and his confidence that the Senate owes him a debt of gratitude. "My services which I have done the Signory shall outtongue his complaints." But unfortunately, the respect that he assumes the senators will show may be compromised by their sense of him as an outsider. This means that he may always be vulnerable to prejudice. Maybe Brabantio can prevail with his fellow Venetians by appealing to their xenophobia. Roderigo has already tried to exploit this prejudice by branding Othello an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere, and Iago calls him an erring barbarian. His separateness is continually underlined by everyone referring to him as the Moor. That is how he is uniquely identified. And even Desdemona uses this term at the very time she's defending him before the Senate. Othello's anomalous situation is indicated in the full title of the play, Othello the Moor of Venice, which recognizes his apparent integration into European society, but still signals his difference in country of origin, in race, in culture, and, it is presumed, in religion. When we see the play on stage, the first thing we notice in this scene is that Othello is a different colour from everyone else. He is the odd man out. And the sight would be particularly striking for the original audiences, as England then was nowhere near as racially integrated as it is now. Brabantio does, of course, hurl at Othello all the stock accusations of primitive prejudice. The black man is thought to be evil and destined for hell. Damned as thou art! And he is, of course, assumed to be involved in black magic, witchcraft, using foul charms by which thou hast enchanted her. And finally, there is the widespread opinion that miscegenation is unnatural, against all rules of nature. Othello's difference in colour might make Desdemona see him as exotic and therefore captivating, but among other Venetians, racial prejudice is deep-rooted. Iago later plays on it by referring to Black Othello, and Emilia in the final scene calls him the blacker devil. Othello is always aware that he isn't fully accepted by his adopted society. Instead, he's widely regarded as an alien. This may be the reason that he not only announces his importance to the state, but also declares, "I fetch my life and being from men of royal siege." He needs to reassure himself of his social status, and even the superiority of his proclaimed royal blood. And this feeling might explain his continuing to assert himself, professionally, legally, and morally. "My parts, my title, and my perfect soul shall manifest me rightly." Perhaps the supreme warrior is not completely secure, either socially or emotionally. And maybe that is why Othello is sometimes a pompous windbag. When he defends himself before the Senate, he talks at great length, despite the fact that they've all been urgently mobilized for an emergency. In contrast to Brabantio's blunt allegations, Othello demonstrates his dignity by ponderous language and by insistence on formality. Instead of simply addressing the senators as "my masters," he inflates this hugely to "most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my very noble and approved good masters." Then, confident of his eloquence and the ability it gives him to dominate proceedings, he announces, "Rude am I in my speech," and says he can only offer a round, unvarnished tale, which sounds ridiculous. It seems to be mock humility and false modesty, and is presumably designed to draw everyone's attention to his verbal superiority and his unique achievements. If so, is this the key to his grandiloquence and verbosity? Is it the behavior of the perennial outsider, who is always aware of the possible need for self-defense against prejudice, and therefore is constantly over-assertive. Is Othello an insecure man who is always fighting to protect his position in the hierarchy? He quashes any suspicions about his religious faith, which might invite moral condemnation, by proclaiming to the senators that he, like them, is a Christian. To heaven I do confess the vices of my blood. Then he launches into the story of his life. Despite having told it once to Brabantio, and then again to Desdemona, he takes advantage of another compliant audience to tell it again, so he can hardly call his tale unvarnished. And later we wonder whether Iago may have some justification in his denunciation of Othello for bragging and telling Desdemona fantastical lies. We have no reason to believe that the tale contains lies, but it certainly seems highly coloured and packed with dramatic excitement. I spoke of most disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent deadly breach. It uncompromisingly presents Othello as a hero and places him in a huge landscape which enhances his stature. Antra's vast and deserts idle, rough quarries, rocks, and hills whose heads touch heaven. The Duke's response, "I think this tale would win my daughter too," is a tribute to Othello's spellbinding narrative. But by classifying it as a tale, the Duke implies that it sounds more like an adventure story than a curriculum vitae. And also that, although his daughter might indeed be captivated, he himself is perhaps not so easily convinced. Desdemona, however, another young woman like the Duke's daughter, seems to respond in a similarly unsophisticated fashion, telling Othello, "If I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her." Her reaction seems to be to relish the enchantment of the romantic tale, rather than build a relationship with the real Othello. And since she says that any complete stranger could woo her with the story, then it sounds as if it's the story that she loves, not the teller. Moreover, if someone can be taught how to tell my story, then again, Othello's description of it as unvarnished is inaccurate, since the narration involves a specialist technique which can be learned. So his scornful dismissal, "This only is the witchcraft I have used," is not quite convincing, because he has indeed entranced the girl, not by dark arts, but by narrative skills, and possibly by enhancing the facts. Another unsettling note is struck when he declares, "She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them." Not only does this again suggest that she was in love with the story, but it sounds as if Othello is in love with it as well. His need to prove himself makes him egotistical, apparently not valuing Desdemona for any of her personal characteristics, but only as a wonderful audience for his performance. Since neither of them is actually getting to know the real other person, their future relationship seems to be based on fantasy. And if they are ever suddenly confronted with the truth, their image of each other may be shattered, and also, crucially, Othello's image of himself. The strong man is not proof against an attack on his self-esteem. In today's terms, Desdemona seems like a naive teenager who has fallen in love with a film star, that is, the heroic image of the actor on the screen. She even describes her attitude to him as worship. To his honours and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. Incredibly, when Othello returns victorious from the sea battle, he seems to justify her idealization of him, and his idealization of himself. He appears to live up to his heroic status, and his stature is all the greater since he emerges triumphant over the wildest and most gigantic elements. The chidden billow seems to pelt the clouds. The wind-shaked surge with high and monstrous mane seems to cast water on the burning bear. Yet he is not content to leave his bravery implicit. He still feels the need to proclaim his ability to survive the most daunting ordeals. May the winds blow till they have wakened death, and let the labouring bark climb hills of seas Olympus high. This compulsion to parade his achievements is driven by the outsider's constant need to prove himself and gain acceptance. He is forever applying for full membership of the society. Othello says something else noteworthy when he lands at Cyprus. He addresses Desdemona as "my fair warrior." This presumably seems to him the ultimate accolade, to invest her with the highest masculine virtues of courage and patriotism. She later calls herself an unhandsome warrior, and also did in fact aspire to be a partner in military exploits when she informed the senators that I did love the more to live with him. My downright violence and storm of fortunes may trumpet to the world. Although Cassio romantically dubs her our great captain's captain, it is clear that Othello must remain dominant. So, for their relationship to work, it is essential that she should adapt totally to his world. She must be termed a soldier because he cannot contemplate any change to his behavior which might suggest weakness. Married life must never be allowed to compromise his masculinity. He assured the Senate that he would never allow love for his wife to make him neglect his duty, for this would reduce his status as a soldier to the humiliating level of female domesticity. Let housewives make a skillet of my helm. It seems to me that this concept of manhood is central to the tragedy. When Cassio loses his position as Othello's lieutenant, he cries out repeatedly for his lost reputation, the respect of others. But he is capable of self-criticism. One imperfectness shows me another, to make me frankly despise myself. He has the confidence to admit his faults, but Cassio can rely on readmittance to the privileged class. He is not an outsider. In contrast, later in the play, when Othello's reputation is at stake, he is totally inflexible. He admits no culpability and regards his plummet in public esteem as irredeemable. Othello's occupation's gone. By referring to himself in the third person, Othello, he shows that he has created a persona which is essential to his social survival, and his occupation is that of the noble soldier, which brings universal respect. He cannot conceive of an identity beyond his public image, so a diminution in prestige would destroy his sense of self-worth. The loss of status is so emotionally overwhelming that he has to comfort himself and restore some dignity by remembering all the panoply of military show. Farewell the neighing steed and the shrill trump, the spirit-stirring drum, the ear-piercing fife, the royal banner, and all quality, pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war. In his despair, he needs to participate in an imaginary ceremony of valediction, as if he were sounding the last post and lowering the flag, so that he can cling to his dreams of glory and the indispensable reassurance of his former fame and preeminence. He told the senators earlier, "Little of this great world can I speak, more than pertains to feats of broil and battle." At the time, this seemed like self-deprecation, which might be masking another proud reference to his achievements. However, in retrospect, his dedication to war actually proves to be a limitation. It makes him vulnerable to Iago's insinuations about Venetian women's alleged promiscuity, and also gives him no knowledge of how to be a husband. He spent all his time in male company, improving his skills in violence, but unfortunately he has no idea of how to relate to a woman, that separate species. His frenzy at the thought of being a cuckold springs from a traditional male view of women who are simply divided into two types, a virgin or a whore. Cassio displays the same attitude and adopts the usual double standard when he visits Bianca for sex, but is amused at the preposterous notion that he might marry her. Iago tries to blame her for the attempt on Cassio's life by denouncing her as a notable strumpet, and later he attempts to invalidate Emilia's accusations against him by calling her villainous whore. His label conveys contempt for any female and distrust of her. However, all the men are horrified at the notion of a woman's infidelity, not just on moral grounds, but because it threatens their reputation and guarantees mockery by other men. Desdemona's reaction to hearing Othello's story when she seemed the adoring, innocent virgin boosted his self-image tremendously. But when she switched to the other category of whore, it totally undermines his public prestige. His homicidal jealousy erupts from his primal need for status which he has gained by being a hero, but which he can lose by being a cuckold. Desdemona's innocence is partly the result of her being kept locked up from the world by her father. He demands, "How got she out?" This may account for her ignorance about Venetian promiscuity. She has to ask the experienced Emilia whether there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kind. But her naivety may be a character trait. When she receives the reply, "There be some such, no question," she insists on clinging to her immature romanticism. "I do not think there is any such woman." Othello was attracted by her youthful purity, because a man of his reputation inevitably wished to marry a virgin, but perhaps also by the fact that she can be easily dominated by an older man. Indeed, she seems almost to be a child bride. She says that she still feels able to be told off like a little girl. Those that do teach young babes do it with gentle means and easy tasks. He might have chid me so, for in good faith I am a child to chiding. When they encounter the reality of a marital relationship, it is difficult to say which is the more naive, Othello or Desdemona. He further betrays his immersion in the masculine world by exhibiting the stereotypical male qualities of being obsessed by competition while being quite unable to handle feelings. Strong emotion overpowers him, and his only response is ferocious violence. "I'll tear her all to pieces! Blood, blood, blood! I will chop her into messes!" On the battlefield, these aggressive instincts may have helped to elevate him to the status of hero, but in domestic circumstances, they result in his degradation to the level of a savage. Desperate as ever to regain control and some dignity, he seizes on the soldier's virtue of unshakable resolution. "My bloody thoughts with violent pace shall ne'er look back." And he again feels the compulsion to magnify his determination by comparing himself to huge and grandiloquently titled natural forces. "Like to the Pontic Sea, the Propontic and the Hellespont." He even tries to provide his commitment to butchery with a form of moral sanction offered by a religious ceremony. "Now by yond marble heaven, in the due reverence of a sacred vow, I here engage my words." But his need to preserve the idealized view he has constructed of himself means that he has to put all the blame on Desdemona. When he later descends to crudely striking his defenseless wife, a shocked Ludovico is incredulous at the fall of the phlegmatic hero. Is this the noble Moor, whom our full senate call all in all sufficient? Is this the nature whom passion could not shake? Othello has failed to live up to this superhuman standard. Inevitably, no one could. He actually articulates his ability to cope with physical pain, but not with emotional torture. "Had it pleased heaven to try me with affliction, had they rained all kinds of sores and shames upon my bare head, steeped me in poverty to the very lips." This would also be preferable because Stoicism is a macho virtue. Undergoing a physical ordeal is often a requirement for promotion to the rank of hero. On the other hand, he cannot tolerate the emotional agony of universal mockery because it diminishes a man's stature. "To make me a fixed figure for the time of scorn, to point his slow unmoving finger at." So he still self-dramatizes, setting the Othello of his imagination on a stage of epic size. "Heaven stops the nose at it, and the moon winks. The bawdy wind that kisses all it meets is hushed within the hollow mine of earth, and will not hear it. He's gaining reassurance of his importance by insisting that his tragedy dominates the universe. And when he says, "Yet 'tis the plague of great ones," he's again complimenting himself with the assumption that the social prominence of great ones guarantees exceptional personal qualities. Then, by declaring "'tis destiny, unshunnable," he not only confirms his importance, because lesser beings are ignored by destiny, but also relieves himself of all responsibility for his actions. They are controlled by the higher force of destiny. Let us not forget, however, that Othello is a figure for whom we feel the greatest compassion. A performance provokes immense pity and moral outrage as we watch the hero being slowly and deliberately tortured by the villain. Shakespeare's audience would have recognized Iago's similarity to the characters called Vice and the Devil in the old morality plays, and so would realize that Othello was similar to their victim, Everyman, and be able to empathize with him as a representative of universal suffering. Modern audiences, however, cannot respond to this old tradition, but on the other hand, they no longer assume that a black man must be evil, so they are readier to identify with Othello as just another human being and feel his pain. This means that witnessing his ordeal at the hands of a sadist is just as grueling. I've been pointing out that Shakespeare demands that we modify our simplistic stereotype of a hero, so we've seen that Othello has many weaknesses. But we still have to remember that the noble general is a good man who is totally innocent until Iago takes control. And like the original audiences, we remember that we all have flaws, but agree that nothing could ever justify the agonies inflicted on him by Iago, the implacable madman. Othello continues to suffer until the very end. He can never regain emotional equanimity. In the final scene, his resolution is interrupted 3 times by his need to kiss his defenseless wife. Meanwhile, he is desperate to preserve his sense of moral rectitude, repeating, "It is the cause," to convince himself of his justification for murder, and saying that Desdemona's beauty "dost almost persuade justice to break her sword." But he writhes in indecision. "Thou makest me call what I intend to do a murder, which I thought a sacrifice." All of this is to maintain his self-image of nobility and honor. But the calm ceremony that he planned turns into a chaos of noise and struggle, with her pleading for mercy, "Kill me tomorrow, let me live tonight," and him bellowing abuse, "Down, strumpet," while he smothers her with ugly brutality. He's left with neither any vestige of dignity nor the comfort of moral certainty. It is a long way from the feats of broil and battle that he earlier boasted of. The great warrior has debased and dishonored himself by murdering a woman in her nightdress. Once more he vacillates between complete loss of confidence — the usually decisive general mutters "what's best to do," and clinging to the conviction of his own importance, so that his dilemma is of universal significance. Methinks it should be now a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globe should yawn at alteration. Emilia shakes his self-belief by contradicting his story, and when she destroys all his dignity, "Oh, gull! Oh, dolt! As ignorant as dirt!" he's reduced to physical intimidation. Valiant Othello contemptibly turns his sword upon a woman. Even when Iago's treachery is unmasked, Othello persists in describing himself as honourable. Why should honour outlive honesty? And he aggrandizes himself by posing with a soldier's superior weapon, a sword of Spain, the Icebrook's temper. He again refers to himself in the third person. Where should Othello go to preserve his self-image? And he once more absolves himself of responsibility by calling Desdemona ill-starred and himself cursed. Instead of examining his values and his prejudices, he only pictures himself suffering another physical ordeal, as usual on a heroic scale. Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight. Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulphur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire. Then he describes himself with a ringing paradox. An honourable murderer, if you will. By which he continues to reassert his pride and diminish his culpability. It is customary in tragedies of the period to follow the hero's death with a spontaneous tribute from a survivor. But Othello preempts this by dictating his own obituary. He needs to ensure that his public image remains intact after his death. He can't offer a detailed eulogy on Desdemona since he never really knew her. And anyway, his priority is, as ever, the preservation of his self-image and his reputation with others. So, as usual, he talks about himself. Immediately he claims, I have done the state some service, trying to reclaim the honour of the patriotic soldier, and also still seeking acceptance in the community where he has always been the outsider. He engineers a suitably dramatic climax, again portraying himself as the defender of his country, when a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, and also the champion of his adopted religion, I took by the throat the circumciser dog. He utilizes his poetic skills to produce a cliched, sentimental ending, rather than facing the truth. I kissed thee ere I killed thee, no way but this, killing myself to die upon a kiss. And of course he arranges the final romantic tableau, in which Desdemona is little more than a prop, for maximum emotional impact and to present himself in the most favourable light. Since Othello has already provided his own eulogy in the most flattering terms, Ludovico is relieved of the duty to equal it. However, you might expect him to say a few polite words, yet he doesn't even mention Othello by name, only referring to his deed. This heavy act. He dismisses the artfully created death tableau as the object and hides it from sight, as if immediately expunging Othello from the history of Venice. Then the representative of the state demotes the general to the status of alien again. The Moor strips him of his possessions, seize upon the fortunes, and addresses Cassio as Lord Governor. Othello has been already replaced by his cashiered lieutenant. The former national hero has been immediately deprived of the legacy and the legend that he fought all his life to create. And so we come to Iago. When I first heard the diagnosis motiveless malignity repeated and repeated with reference to him, I was taken aback. Motiveless? I think we need to take a closer look. In fact, the opening lines provide a neat motive. Iago is apparently resentful because he was passed over for promotion. This would be quite acceptable for a Jacobean audience who were familiar from other plays of the times with characters categorized as malcontents, villains who had become embittered because they felt themselves undervalued by their powerful social superiors. In the first scene, this seems a perfectly adequate motive, but we might not be so sure by the end of the play, when Iago has contrived the deaths of Othello and Desdemona and the attempted murder of Cassio, and has killed Roderigo and Emilia by his own hand, and then faces excruciating torture and execution. All that because another candidate got the job. However, in Act 1, it sounds convincing. Anyway, we are soon distracted by the panic that Iago causes, and are impressed by his energy and resourcefulness. Certainly, the malcontent's resentment could be the motive for the apparent delight he takes in goading the powerful Brabantio. Moreover, his cleverness in manipulating Roderigo is also recognizable from another stock character of the time, the Machiavellian villain, the ruthless schemer who ingeniously manipulates and lies to everybody. But then we are confronted by Iago's first soliloquy, and we are totally confused. I hate the Moor, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he's done my office. Eh? Pardon? What? Where did that come from? Othello has committed adultery with Iago's wife? No, let me correct that. It is thought that he has, according to Iago. But no one else has mentioned this, and there is no evidence for it. Anyway, Iago insisted at some length to Roderigo that his objection to Othello was on professional grounds, not acutely personal ones. What is going on? And that is when we need to remember that this is a theatrical soliloquy, and therefore is governed by an important convention. Whether the speaker is a hero like Hamlet or a villain like Iago, the same rule applies. He may lie to other characters or conceal the facts from them, but when he is alone, addressing the audience directly, then he is telling the truth. This dramatic device has been called thinking aloud, which guarantees its veracity. So this baffling confession, suddenly blurted out, is the truth that Iago conceals from everyone, except the audience. He is secretly convinced that Othello has been to bed with Emilia. Although he no doubt does feel resentment at being beaten for promotion by Cassio, his real motivation erupts from his sexual insecurity. This causes him to feel a complete failure, and then to assume that his inadequacy must have led to him being supplanted by his sexual superior, Othello. Of course, he ignores this flash of self-revelation, or suppresses it because it's too painful. But this is what generates his burning hatred. Now we realize that his outburst in the first scene was partly an excuse. He honestly has cause for complaint about his lack of promotion, but in fact, his animosity has much stronger and deeper origins. When we recall the conventions attached to the theatrical soliloquy, we realize that Iago's earlier excuse was not delivered to the audience and therefore accepted as truth, but to Roderigo, the dupe who is fed continual lies. Now we find that we too have been deceived. Of course, it makes complete sense psychologically. Iago is terrified of admitting weakness and of suffering the mockery of other men, so he certainly isn't going to display vulnerability to anyone, least of all to Roderigo, the fool for whom he feels such contempt. When Iago took such a major part in arousing Brabantio, it seemed as if he intervened because Roderigo's more civilized approach wouldn't produce the necessary shock and horror. But in retrospect, his taunts reflect his own obsession. An old black ram is topping your white ewe! And you'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse! These jibes picture Othello as a male of supreme sexual potency. In his first soliloquy, Iago says, "I hate the Moor!" And not only can we see why, but we now also understand the repetition of hate from the start. Roderigo complained, "Thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy hate." Then Iago later insisted, "I do hate him as I do hell pains," which sounded extreme. And then he repeated, "I retell thee again and again, I hate the Moor." Both the reiteration and the vehemence are finally explained to us, but only under the convention of the soliloquy, which is as frank and as secret as a Roman Catholic's confession. We also understand his motive behind, "If thou canst cuckold him, thou dost thyself a pleasure, me a sport." Iago is haunted by the terror that he is himself a cuckold, the butt of other men's jokes, which would humiliate him publicly and deride his sexual inadequacy. Unable to assert his own sexual prowess, he needs to destroy Othello, the apparent beneficiary of Iago's failure, and a constant reminder of his inferiority. The noble and valiant general must be reduced to the same status of public joke. If Iago is to recover any self-respect and the respect of others, he must degrade Othello's physical superiority, which has been proved in battle and through his sufferings. He must dismiss the Moor's assumed sexual superiority as no more than the attribute of an animal. Although Iago has implied that Othello is sexually powerful by terming him a ram and a horse, he expresses contempt for humans who are no better than animals. Ere I would say I would drown myself for the love of a guinea hen, I would exchange my humanity with a baboon. Drown cats and blind puppies. He excuses his own fear of sexual failure by demeaning people who are attracted by sex, describing them as if they are merely gratifying bestial lust. As prime as goats, as hot as monkeys, as salt as wolves in pride. This may partly proceed from a widespread tradition that a black man is better sexually equipped than a white man. Iago specifies a black ram and a Barbary horse. This is another possible factor impelling Iago to demonstrate his mental supremacy and thus his elevation above the Moor, whom he insists is no more than an animal. When he says that Othello will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are, the comparison again recognizes the beast's sexual reputation. An ass is grotesquely well hung, but stresses its mental inferiority. Iago will revel in leading Othello by the nose because it will reinstate him in his own estimation and prove that the human Iago is easily able to control the animal Othello. Sex has to be downgraded to making the beast with two backs, or dismissed as merely a temporary appetite, the food that to him now is as luscious as locusts. Even romantic love is debased to a lust of the blood. By reducing all sexual activity to the level of animal instinct, Iago is trying to elevate his own talent for scheming, prove his higher status as an intelligent human, and forget the doubts that plague him. He boasts to Roderigo that the destruction of Othello's marriage is not too hard for my wits. His brains guarantee his superiority. Bitterness about his implied inability to satisfy a woman explains his hostility towards Emilia. When they land at Cyprus, he publicly typecasts her as a nagging wife, but significantly places her in the bedroom when I have list to sleep. Then he enumerates her faults in all the rooms, but noticeably ends with housewives in your bedrooms. Since he later calls Bianca a housewife, he seems to be categorizing Emilia as a whore. He continues similarly, you rise to play and go to bed to work, implying that he is the victim of her voracious sexual demands. Of course, he blames her, not his own deficiencies. In his following conversation with Desdemona, his simple rhymes about the various kinds of women masquerade as an exercise in wit, but actually betray the breadth of his misogyny. Since all women make him feel inadequate, all must be vilified. His final line, that the perfect woman would only be fit to suckle fools and chronicle small beer, is an ironically disappointing climax, which is criticized by the naive Desdemona with an unconsciously appropriate phrase, "Oh, most lame and impotent conclusion." These are the very words that Iago fears to hear from a woman. And his terror explains his crude nastiness about Cassio, who is obviously pleasing the women. "Yet again your fingers to your lips. Would they were clyster pipes for your sake." Similarly, his envy of Othello results in him deliberately interrupting his superior's time in bed with Desdemona, first on their wedding night in Venice, and then during the celebration of his nuptial in Cyprus. Iago's behavior here is spiteful, and the method is unimpressive. I think he demeans himself. But of course it confirms the mania of his sexual jealousy. In his second soliloquy, Iago repeats his delusion about being cuckolded by Othello. "For that I do suspect the lustful Moor hath leapt into my seat." But then, incredibly, he adds, "I fear Cassio with my nightcap too." And again there is absolutely no evidence. Iago's feelings about Cassio have festered from his resentment about the promotion issue, then to contempt for the lieutenant's shallow personal qualities that attract women, all those requisites that folly and green minds look after, to awareness of him as a threat, framed to make women false, and finally to another sudden assumption that he must therefore have supplanted Iago in the marital bed. Shakespeare is using the transition from the first to the second soliloquy to let us witness the process of Iago's sexual insecurity growing into the wildest paranoia. Even in Act 5, Iago is still spitting out hatred for Cassio, but in the vaguest terms, as if he himself is unwilling to confront his reasons. "He hath a daily beauty in his life, which makes me ugly." As part of his siege on Othello's confidence, Iago makes up a story about sharing a bed with Cassio and hearing him talk in his sleep. It's a crude fabrication designed to torture Othello with its specific physicality. Even so, the description of this complete invention is so unrestrainedly detailed and has such relentless power that Iago seems to me to be actually narrating his own nightmare of Cassio in bed with Emilia. "In sleep I heard him say, 'Sweet Desdemona, let us be wary, let us hide our loves.' And then, sir, would he grip and wring my hand, cry, 'Oh, sweet creature,' then kiss me hard, as if he plucked up kisses by the roots that grew upon my lips, then laid his leg over my thigh, and sighed and kissed." Although Iago is cunningly using this fantasy to provoke Othello into agonized outrage, it seems to me to be remarkably heartfelt. Its lack of subtlety suggests personal emotional involvement. But it's all paranoia. Emilia is a faithful wife. She later comments that his suspicions are unjustified. "Some such squire he was that turned your wit the seamy side without, and made you to suspect me with the Moor." By saying that his wit has been turned, she's complaining that his logic has been twisted by jealousy. This is the fault that he exploits in Othello, but it is also, ironically, his own weakness. Iago revels in behaving like the Vice from the morality plays, chatting to the audience and challenging their condemnation. And what's he then that says I play the villain? He is making a specific reference to a traditional theatrical role, play the villain, looking round the theatre and almost inviting a reply. He seduces the theatre-goers by offering a personal relationship with them, encouraging them to laugh with him at other characters' gullibility, and including the audience in his plans. Two things are to be done. Aye, that's the way. And this feeling of being taken into his confidence persists when he often poses as another figure from the morality plays, the virtue, honesty. He even later pretends to accuse himself. "O wretched fool, that livest to make thine honesty a vice!" His juxtaposition of honesty and vice are lost on Othello, but apparent to the audience. Iago's soliloquies are a conduit for his real thoughts and feelings, but they're also a chance for him to ingratiate himself with everyone in the theatre, just as he ingratiates himself with most characters in the play. Iago also portrays himself in another central role from medieval drama, a devil. Divinity of hell! When devils will the blackest sins put on? By adopting this deliberate pose as the incarnation of evil, he affects to possess supernatural abilities, to horrify and intimidate the audience. This gives him a feeling of infinite power, so he almost gambles in delight at the exercise of his dominance. But again, it seems to me to be conscious posturing, which enables him to forget his real motive and hide his weaknesses. When Emilia unconsciously categorizes her husband as a most villainous knave, some base notorious knave, some scurvy fellow, he tries to shut her up, speak within door. It sounds to me as if he detests being reduced to this mundane level. But by masquerading as a devil, he can escape the reality of the cuckold's dread and enjoy the illusion of motiveless malignity on a cosmic scale, far greater even than the giant landscape in which Othello places himself. Iago certainly succeeds throughout the play in proving his cleverness. He's brilliant at knowing which of Othello's buttons to press, and when to press, and how hard. But while he is inwardly smirking at his pretended concern about suspicion, "Good God, the souls of all my tribe defend from jealousy," he seems oblivious to the irony that he is actually consumed by jealousy. This can make him seem to the audience rather less intellectually impressive than his smug delight indicates. Perhaps his greatest success comes when Othello collapses in a fit. The mighty conqueror is defeated, psychologically and emotionally, by the conviction that his wife is unfaithful. He's deprived of his impressive command of language, which separates humans from animals. Pish! Noses, ears, and lips! He loses his dignity by falling down literally beneath Iago's level, and lying there he's totally in Iago's power. His first words when he recovers are, "Dost thou mock me?" He's haunted by his sense of humiliation. After that, it is inevitable that Iago will be able to channel his victim's passions towards the murder of Desdemona. And now we arrive at the greatest irony. We have seen that all of Iago's efforts to compensate for his sexual insecurity by proving his intellectual dominance are wasted. His achievements in deceiving everyone and his success in destroying Othello are void. He exposes the Moor's terror of being branded a cuckold, but we know that he is possessed by a similar terror. All this we know. Yet, much more significantly, we can now see that while he thinks he's demonstrating his superiority because Othello is so easily convinced, in fact, Iago himself is even more easily convinced of his own wife's infidelity. He lectured Roderigo, "We have reason to cool our raging motions," boasting that he can control his emotions by using his rationality. But in fact, he's not in control of his own raging motions. They motivate all his behavior. When he first blurted out his conviction that Othello had cuckolded him, he added, "I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety." At least Othello demanded proof. The handkerchief and Desdemona's childish lie about its loss, Iago's testimony, and Cassio's behavior. But Iago admits that he has no proof at all of Emilia's infidelity beyond his own anxiety. And his confession, "I fear Cassio with my nightcap too," also seems to burst from him without a shred of evidence. In a brief soliloquy after grabbing the handkerchief, he gloats over Othello's gullibility. "Trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmations strong as proofs of holy writ." Yet he seems completely unaware that he's also condemning his own frailty. So the formidable reason that he flaunts to reassure himself is in fact just as weak as Othello's, or even weaker, for it is also subsumed by the power of emotion, but with less justification. Similarly, he takes delight in poisoning Othello's mind. "Dangerous conceits are in their natures poisons, which burn like the mines of sulphur." But he doesn't recognize that he's already applied the same simile to himself. "The thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw my innards." So the man who outwits everyone isn't clever enough to realize the devastating truth about himself, that he is also poisoned by his subconscious. The audience, however, may perceive it and be less impressed by his vaunted intelligence. Furthermore, the last scene proves just as catastrophic for Iago as for Othello. He also finds his certainty and his control slipping away from him. And the similarity between his downfall and Othello's is underlined by the fact that it is Emilia in both cases who's responsible for the awful truth emerging, confronting first one man and then the other. Iago, in mounting desperation, tries to silence her again and again. "Charm your tongue. I charge you, get you home. Hold your peace. Be wise and get you home. Villainous whore! Filth, thou liest!" But the puppet master cannot control his own woman, although women, of course, were the ones for whom he expressed such contempt. He tries to put her in her place. Get you home! But she asserts herself over her husband. Perchance, Iago, I will ne'er go home. There is a final devastating irony that, having believed himself undermined by Emilia's alleged adultery, he's ultimately unmasked by her honesty. She accuses him. You told a lie, an odious, damned lie! Despite all his habitual hostility towards her, she has been a dutiful wife. 'Tis proper I obey him. It is only his evil that makes her end her subservience, but not now. Moreover, Iago enjoyed proving his control over Othello by inducing him to murder Desdemona. But the subordinate now finds that he has lost the ability to control anyone, and is as helpless as his general, and his final failure is that he is also reduced to murdering his own wife. This crude and vicious act is not the feat of a mastermind. When he is captured, he may appear defiant. From this time forth I never will speak word. But in fact, he's only hoping to hide the shameful motivation that he has always frantically concealed throughout. However, Graziano's response, "Torments will ope your lips," guarantees that the secret will soon be revealed to the world. Meanwhile, if the audience were to be excluded from the revelation, they might feel that Iago's silence makes him brave or mysterious. But the sad truth has already been disclosed to them by the conventions of the soliloquy. Perhaps it seems that Iago wins some kind of victory, in that Ludovico's final speech devotes more time to him than to Othello. O Spartan dog, more fell than anguish, hunger, or the sea, look on the tragic loading of this bed. This is thy work. But agonizing punishment is again demanded. The torture, oh, enforce it! So it is confirmed that inevitably the villain will eventually have to confess his obsessions and therefore expose himself to the ultimate humiliation. To conclude, what is Othello really about, in my opinion? It's fundamentally about male insecurity and its effect upon the male himself and on those about him, which can be catastrophic. The man who is confident of his dominance puffs out his chest in pride, demands deference from other men, and feels assured of his sexual success with women. But the man who feels that his status is threatened lives in fear that others might learn of his vulnerability and look down on him. So in order to protect himself, he may resort to extreme measures which can destroy other people. Nowadays we're all familiar with TV wildlife documentaries which show male animals fighting to determine which is the strongest. Then the ultimate victor mounts the females so that the genes of the fittest to survive are passed on to the next generation. It is commonly suggested that human males, who share 99% of their DNA with chimpanzees, exhibit similar primary instincts. And of course, the term alpha male is now used about humans. It seems to me that what obsesses the men in Othello is the traditional figure of the hero and his potency in battle and in bed. And it still obsesses many people today. The alpha male is often central to modern films, in which he has to demonstrate that he's got the balls, that he's aggressive, physically daring, and sexually capable. This primitive force can drive entire lives and devastate them. An overriding need to prove one's masculinity and establish one's position in the male hierarchy can raise a man to the highest public virtue or sink him to the lowest private sin. It's a paradox that while we think of a hero and a villain as being polar opposites, in this play they're actually closely similar in that they are both driven by insecurity. And for both of them, this leads to their abject failure, and to the brink of madness, and to the bloody savagery of wild animals. The play's original audience assumed that a dramatic tragedy would depict a protagonist, often a king, who falls from social eminence and happiness to misery and death. Shakespeare challenged their expectations by making his eponymous hero a soldier and black. But when the hero murders his totally innocent wife to protect his own ego, it may be that our sympathies are stretched too far. With my modern sensibility and cultural norms, I am completely appalled by so-called honor killings, so I cannot pardon the murder of Desdemona under any mitigating circumstances. But in my reaction to the play as a whole, I can perhaps broaden my definition of tragedy. I've suggested that Othello's feelings are in some way similar to Iago's, and that there are parallels in their endings. So in fact, both the hero and the villain are victims of the same obsession. That makes me widen my focus. An intense concern with masculinity, which we may trace to evolutionary imperatives, is something which still nowadays destroys lives. The lives of the driven men and the lives of the people surrounding them. Like Othello and Iago, and Desdemona and Emilia, all of us may be victims of this primal urge. And since its powerful force with the potential for disaster is still prevalent everywhere today, I find myself feeling that this is a tragedy which goes beyond the Moor and the Venetians to be inflicted on the whole human race.